191. We appreciate the presence of Assemblymember Emmanuel Perez, who is here on his AB 2669. Assemblymember, if you'll step forward, we'll try and take this matter up while we're collecting members. I hope you'll understand if we work as a subcommittee, I think that'll be a good use of your time as well as ours.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And senators that are here, appreciate this opportunity. And if I may, in numerous small, unincorporated communities throughout our state, residents rely mostly on private groundwater wells as their primary source of potable water. Many of these wells, however, are contaminated. When a community water system becomes contaminated, exceeding maximum contaminant levels, residents must be notified within 30 days regarding the levels of the given contaminant and potential dangers of consuming the contaminated water, among other important information. Public notification to residents regarding contaminated drinking water is necessary to prevent illness and disease and protect public health. However, while many impacted residents are non-English speaking, many are being noticed about dangerous drinking water in a language they do not understand. AB 2669, as amended, would clarify and codify existing environmental health regulations pertaining to public notifications to ensure that notifications serve their intended purpose. Specifically, the measure would require that a public water system required to notice residents of the contamination of their drinking water must do so in English and in the language spoken by a non-English speaking group, if that group exceeds 1,000 residents or exceeds 10% of the residents in the community. The bill would also require the notice to include a telephone number or address where residents may contact the public water system for assistance, as well as a telephone number where the residents may contact the Department of Public Health for additional information. In addition to the new provisions, the bill makes other clarifying amendments to ensure Department of Public Health considers environmental documentation's cost when determining funding. Here in support of the measure is Marta Guzman, a SEVIS from California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation, and I respectfully ask for your vote.
Thank you. Witnesses in support, briefly, please.
Senator, Sierra LA Foundation in strong support for this, what we consider a technical and very important clarifying change to the Health and Safety Code. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other witnesses in support? Are there any witnesses in opposition? Once again, let me ask if there are any witnesses in opposition. Are there any comments or questions from members of the committee? Senator Rowe.
Yeah, just a quick question. The issue in regards to the language requirement, where does this bill go from here right now?
Well, assuming we approve the bill here in committee, it will go to the floor of the Senate next. Yes.
Well, that would be my question. It seems to me that this could very well be an issue of a state issue in regards to a reimbursable cost to these agencies, because we're setting up a criteria for notification for them that's different than the current law, correct?
Not necessarily. Actually, this is already in law. The 1,000 residents or the 10% of residents in the community.
What's the bill do if it's already the law?
Well, what's happening here, unfortunately, though, even though it's the law, folks are still not receiving those notices. And what's happening is many times they may be receiving a notice in English with a phone number, and that's all they're receiving.
Well, that's my point. My point is now you're requiring more specifically for the language requirement, correct? And the notification then for the phone number to where they can talk with somebody in that language.
Yes.
Okay, so now I see all those as new expenses then that you are now putting on a agency that the state is now doing through statute. And so my question is, isn't that then become an issue for a claim that agency could make against the state?
Let me interrupt for just a moment, because the staff has had some conversations with our Senate Appropriations folks, and I think that might clarify.
Just for clarification, what I do when we have amendments is I make sure that the Appropriations Committee is aware of the amendments and whether or not they think they need to see the bill under Rule 10.5. And with regards to both this bill and Senator Wright's bill, the feeling was they did not need to see that. Now, that doesn't mean Rules Committee or something like that, but I mean that's subject to the Rules Committee under Rule 10.5. I think they saw this if it would not be a reimbursable mandate because of the fee authority that the districts have to raise fees to provide their services include providing notices. So I'm just relaying what I suggested because I did make sure they were aware of the additional requirement in the bill.
Okay. We'll take a look at that because I'm not sure because you can charge a fee somewhere on something. Do you not have a response? Can you then not claim this as a charge back to the state? Is something we'll look at. But that would be my concern. My concern, sure. It seems to me that we're creating another requirement, cost passing on then to the local government, and I guess the answer here is we're going to just do a fee so that all the taxpayers have to pay more money in order for the notification. So either one of those probably don't sound very reasonable to
Gentlemen, I don't want to shortcut this discussion, but I'm guessing neither one of you is going to persuade the other today. I do think.
Well, right, but I think it's an appropriate discussion for us to have as a total.
Absolutely, and as I said, I wanted folks to know that the staff has been in touch with the Appropriations Committee, as a matter of course, on both measures that are before the committee today. The feedback they got, of course, was at the staff level. That doesn't preclude someone from exercising a judgment or jurisdiction in a different form or fashion, but the conversation has taken place. Why don't we, if you'll forgive the interruption, Assembly Member, why don't we go ahead and call the roll so we can establish a quorum, because that will allow us to ask for a motion on your bill, and I'm sure that's what you'd like us to do.
Appreciate that.
Call the roll.
Semidian.
Here.
Runner.
Here.
Corbett.
Here.
Hancock. Lowenthal. Pavley.
Here.
Strickland.
A quorum is present. Do we have any other comments or questions from members before we ask this Assembly Member if you'd like to close?
I'd be glad to move it.
All right. Assembly Member, would you like to offer a close before we ask for a motion?
I respectfully ask for a vote.
Thank you very much. Motion on the bill, Senator Pavley?
So moved.
So moved. Thank you very much. Call the roll.
Semidian.
Aye.
Semidian, aye. Runner.
No.
Runner, no. Corbett.
Aye.
Corbett, aye. Hancock. Lowenthal. Pavley. Pavley, aye. Strickland. 3 yes, 1 no.
The vote is 3-1. Requires 4 votes. We'll hold the measure on call so that other members may vote when they come to the chambers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member. Good luck.
We should have a letter.
Okay. We have one other item. My understanding is the author present, planning to be present?
He's somewhere. He's on his way.
Is it the author's desire to have his staff present? Do we have a letter to that effect?
We'll have one.
How about a written note?
The text.
If we get one.
A letter is on the way.
Well, let me ask the staff member to come forward, introduce himself to the committee, and let's take it from there.
He's busy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My apologies. Mr. Wright, I'm sure, will be showing up any second, hopefully.
Would you introduce yourself to the committee?
I'm sorry. Stan Diori. I'm Legislative Director for Senator Wright.
Mr. Diori, the reason I'm asking about the member is because there may be some conditions, and are you authorized to speak for the member?
Yes, I am.
Some conditions? All right. Then why don't I go ahead and ask you to very briefly present on behalf of the member, and that's based on your assurance that a letter will be forthcoming.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
SB 1351 was substantially amended in this committee to require the State Resources Board to provide 45 days notice on its website of any implementation schedule reporting form required by industry to comply with the regulation. When the bill went over to Assembly Natural Resources, staff made a number of strong suggestions for a couple of technical changes in terms of terminology and to change the 45 days to 60 days. Those were all, I repeat, all at the request of Senate Natural Resources Committee. We believed at that time...
Excuse me, Senate Natural Resources?
I'm sorry, Assembly, I apologize.
Thank you.
We continued to make the point that the bill had to be consistent with what came out of this committee. We believe the terminology and changes were consistent, and nobody raised any issue. It passed the Assembly 78-0, and as far as our understanding, there is no opposition to the bill in its current form. The committee analysis has raised several technical interpretation questions, and I will leave it at that for right now.
All right. Witnesses in support.
Mr. Chairman and members, Jack Gualco with the Gualco Group on behalf of the bill sponsor, the California Council for Environmental and Economic Balance. As the committee will recall from our presentation when the bill was originally before this committee, we made it crystal clear that our members are interested in compliance with AB 32, and in order to do that, to get the best information possible in as timely a manner as possible. So as the bill has progressed through the process, we've been very mindful of your admonition about making it very close to your policy direction. I think we've successfully gone through those minefields and the measures before you now as amended by the Assembly Policy Committee. So we would ask for recommendation to the floor that you concur in the Assembly amendments.
All right, then thank you. Are there other witnesses in support? Other witnesses in support? Are there witnesses in opposition? Comments or questions from members of the committee? Senator Pavley.
Yeah, maybe either the staff representing the author or your staff, Mr. Simonian, can just walk me through how this has changed from the original bill, which was a 45-day just sort of transparency thing on letting them know when a regulation was going to come forward. My reading of this is a major new definition. I don't see it as a clarification on a compliance tool with the vague language of "but not limited to," and what that essentially means. And
hang on a second, Mr. Doria has staff joining him to help present the bill.
So I'm going to need, and I do appreciate, first of all, the bill coming back to committee, which was one of my requests when I voted for the bill to let it out of this committee. It was really relatively just a simple transparency kind of good government bill on making sure people were aware of a forthcoming regulation. This has, I think, is a substantial change from the bill in these new sections on what a compliance tool is, but not limited to, and a whole list of things that could generate long delays or lawsuits or confusion. And so I just need to have a real clear discussion of how this bill changed, what it is they're trying to accomplish, and why does compliance tool have a list of 20 or so things, but not limited to, which could be a million things. I just see it as a minefield, so I need a discussion to change my mind, because right now I have a problem with the way this bill has changed, but I supported the original bill.
Right. Let me suggest that we ask committee staff to articulate a little more clearly and a little more fully the changes that have been made since the bill left this committee and the concerns that raises in the view of the committee staff as articulated in comment number 3 in the published analysis. That will then give the author time to catch his breath and have a sense for where the concerns might be, and then we'll give the author and his sponsors or witnesses an opportunity to respond if they wish. All right, so why don't we ask committee staff, Mr. Pester, if you'd share your assessment of what's new in the world since this bill left committee.
Sure. Now, if everybody has a copy of the bill that's in your packet there, and I can go page and line number. I see the sponsors also passed out a highlighted version, but there's a couple of clarification that needs to be done on that too. First of all, on page 2, this is of the August. We're all looking at the August 2nd version, the most recent version. On page 2, lines 22 through 25, and on page 3, lines 1 through 2, the definition of compliance tool was added to include a number of items, including but not limited to, and it specifies.
Go ahead and read them out.
Computer models, databases, algorithms, formulas, forms, software, labels, protocols, and metrics required for compliance. But that's not an all-inclusive list because of the provision including but not limited to. Metric is referenced in that definition of compliance tool and is then defined on page 4, lines 4 through 6, is the definition of metric to mean units and standards of measurement by which efficiency, performance, progress, or quality of a plan, process, or product can be assessed. On Section 2 of the bill, Subdivision A, when it left the committee, this referred to reporting forms. Only reporting that you had to do an implementation schedule and make it publicly available, and that the reporting form had to be available 45 days before it was due. That, in summary, is what it was when it left the committee. Right. Now, when it came back, what you see here is that it includes reporting. It includes the reporting form, includes the compliance tool, and it includes training. And compliance tool, again, goes back to that definition that was previously to change the 45 days to 60 days. And then also added subdivision B that says if there's any modifications, they have to be, then the deadline is extended for 60 days. Now, the issues raised in the analysis are, number one, on page 2, line 23, the reference to including but not limited to may provide some challenges for the Air Resources Board when someone in the regulated community may say this is something that should have been included as a compliance mechanism, and it's not included in that definition. Number 2 was on page 4, lines 35 through 36, where it says required to be published pursuant to subdivision A, and there's no requirement in subdivision A to publish anything. Item number 3 is the issue on when a regulation is modified, then the regulated entities have 60 days to comply. It's not clear whether that applies to the initial regulation, so they have additional time if they didn't already comply with that, or if that only relates to the modified regulation. And then the 4th item that was raised is whether or not this revision, this authorization for the ARB to revise an implementation schedule, reporting form, compliance tool, or training when it modifies the compliance deadline is outside the requirements of the Administrative Procedure Act. Those are the 4 issues that are raised in the analysis.
Senator Pavley, other comments or questions?
No, I think that's a very good summary.
Certainly comprehensive in its scope. Senator Wright, I think you have some sense, and Mr. McGann, are you rising to come forward and speak in support of the bill?
Actually, in opposition.
All right.
Very briefly, then.
Here's what I'd like to do. Senator Wright, I want to give you the prerogative where I think everybody's struggling a little bit with schedules. We have called for witnesses in support and opposition. We've got a late witness. I would like to take the late witness or witnesses if there's more than one. There appear to be 2. That being said, would you like for us to hear from them before you have a chance to respond to?
I wasn't aware. Why don't we hear from them since?
Okay, I think it'd be helpful.
And I was late.
Well, no, I think it'd be helpful for. I think it'd be easier for you to respond if you've got the benefit of hearing whatever it is they're going to lay on the table, rather than have. I'd like to give you the last words. What I'm trying to say on this.
Thank you.
Why don't we see how many witnesses do we have in opposition? 2? 3. I'm going to ask the first 2 witnesses to speak briefly, a couple minutes each, and I'm going to ask the 3rd witness to be a me too, and I'm going to let you sort out who's who. Then I'm going to go back in fairness and say, are there any other witnesses in support? And then we're going to go back to Senator Wright to sort through these issues. If you'd introduce yourself, please.
Bill McGavin with Sierra Club, California. I want to apologize to the author and the committee for being late this afternoon. Very briefly, we do understand the intent of the author and the sponsors to make sure that when an entity needs to comply with a regulation, that they understand what's needed for compliance. We just want to make sure there are no unintended consequences, that the Administrative Procedures Act is followed, and that there is clarity on all sides about the implementation process. And so, therefore, we recommend that the committee adopt the amendments that are explained in Section 3 of the analysis.
The challenge, of course, is that this is back to us on concurrence, and I don't think we have the opportunity to adopt. It's a straight up or down vote.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. Then our position is opposed unless amended, so if these amendments cannot be taken, we urge the committee to hold the bill.
All right. Could we ask for our next witness in opposition, please?
Senator, members of the committee, Dan Cobb with Union Concerned Scientists, we concur with the remarks of the Sierra Club. Unfortunately, we only got hold of these just within the past couple hours and haven't had a chance to analyze them. If there was a way to find another legislative vehicle for the senator to put this into a new bill somewhere with the committee's amendments, that would be preferable. Otherwise, we'd have to oppose as currently drafted. Thank you.
All right. Next witness, and I think it's a Me Too at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Tina Andlin of the Planning and Conservation League, and we also have to be opposed to this bill, and we apologize for rushing over here.
Well, thank you very much.
I concur with the previous two, if we can do this.
Are there any other witnesses in opposition? Are there any other witnesses in support? All right, then I think we're back to the author. You've had concerns that have been articulated, I think, by Senator Pavley, and the staff has described the nature of the changes. Why don't we take it from there? Senator Corbett, you got a point of view on this yet, or are you keeping your cards close to your vest so far? No comments yet. Okay, thank you. Senator Wright?
I think a couple of things. When we started this process, again, it was an attempt to try to provide clarity. If that's not done, I mean, given where we are, I mean, we could perhaps do an urgency piece. I'm not aware that I have another vehicle at this point to put something back in. I mean, one of the difficulties that you always have in this is that's what's clear to the Assembly isn't always clear to the Senate, and vice versa. We frankly thought most of the amendments were innocuous, to tell you the truth. And so as we took them, it didn't, I mean, a lot of it was code references as opposed to changes in what we perceive to be the actual implementation of the bill. That being said, I'm not sure, I mean, where we go. I mean, again, we could attempt to do an urgency piece, could look for something. I would hate to lose the entire substance of what the bill does because we're having a concern about, there's clearly no intention to deal with the administrative procedure elements or some of the other things that were referenced. And I might defer to the committee as to a remedy to salvage something good so that the perfect doesn't become the enemy.
Let me interject myself here, if I may. Although, Mr. Cuoco, if you have comments, happy to take them at this time.
Well, I'm more than prepared to go through each of the issues that the committee staff raised, if that's the committee's pleasure. But I just want to reiterate what the author just indicated, which is we were very careful during every iteration of this bill to check off with committee staff, and I'm aware of correspondence between the Assembly
Mr.
Committee and this
I'm
committee.
I'm going to interrupt at this point. I've seen. We can do this the old-fashioned way, and we can sit here and play gotcha games. I've seen the email correspondence, and I've seen the responses from the committee staff to the committee staff on the Assembly side on not one but two occasions back in the month of June expressing concern. So I really don't think we want to go down that path. Alternatively, we could actually sit here and have a conversation about what might be in the public interest and see if we could sort that out, and I would suggest that's our best bet. So,
absolutely. All
right, then let's do this. First of all, I want to go to Sergeant at Arms. We're missing 3 members, and it's going to take 4 members to move a bill. So if we could call the other 3 members and tell them that given that the session starts in 3 minutes and the committee is supposed to wrap up by 2, if we could ask Senators Hancock, Senator Strickland, and Senator Lowenthal to join us. Okay. We'd ask them to join us, and I'm sure they're in other places, but we've got 2 bills that we have to lift the call on here shortly. Senator Corbett, I don't want to preempt any comments you might like to make, but here's a possibility. We're stuck because we have a 48-hour obligation under our rules to take action on the bill, which would mean we could either vote it up or vote it down, but we've got to take action in 48 hours. I am of the view, as Senator Pavley articulated, that what we've got before us is a substantial expansion of the bill. That's not a criticism. That's just a characterization. That's my observation about the fact that when it left, it sort of looked like a sort of a modest little, hey, as long as we're going to ask people to fill out forms, they ought to have the darn form 45, 60 days ahead of time so they know what it is they're supposed to fill out and can get it done in a timely fashion. We've gone way beyond all that now. And again, that's not a judgmental observation. That's my characterization of the sort of scope of the effort. I think the concerns that are raised in the analysis about interpretation are legitimate, and I share Senator Pavley's concerns that absent some clarification, we're likely to see people who are not enthusiastic about complying using litigation to avoid compliance rather than using this as a means to have fair notice well in advance of what it is they need to do. I do think there's a solution, and I want to offer it to you now. We can vote the bill up, we can vote the bill down, or, given our time frame, we could vote the bill out of committee with a commitment from the author to prepare a letter to the file that clarifies these issues. And unfortunately, the only way we can do it, given our timing, is to say the letter to the file would have to be satisfactory to the chair, and that if the letter to the file weren't satisfactory to the chair in terms of clarification, that the author would agree not to move the bill forward.
I'll take it a step further. I would submit to the chair to draft the letter.
And then that may or may not be satisfactory to other members of the committee. I got some who are scrunching their faces and shaking their heads. I got others who are adding, like, okay, that seems a Solomonic decision. And then I got others who just, I said Solomonic, not demonic, Mr. Lowenthal. And then I've got others who've just walked into the conversation altogether. So, okay, that I think is one way to get there. And then to the extent that, frankly, I think all this is better done with some legislative clarification in addition to or in lieu of a letter to the file, that's something that could be taken up next year, perhaps on an urgency basis if need be. And I'm tossing that out there as a possibility.
The letter certainly works. The urgency, put forth, and a third, again, not aware of the possibility if there's a vehicle that can be commandeered, and we'll look for that. We'll clearly do the letter, and we'll commit certainly to, if necessary, do an urgency bill next year to refine that element that's described. So, I'm open to all three, and they're not mutually exclusive, so we could attempt all three as well. And I would draft. I'm certainly not trying to give you or your staff work, but if the language is something that requires specificity, then there's no better way to make it that way than if you write it yourself, because then you know exactly what you were saying. So I would be comfortable writing it with or taking your draft and doing the letter to make clear what we were trying to do. So.
Committee members, what's your will? We need 4 votes to move a product out of committee. Senator Corbett.
I have some questions.
Go to it.
Number one, I'm having a hard time visualizing how a letter to the file could accomplish all that needs to be accomplished. So that's a little bit of a hard sell on me, but I'd keep an open mind to see the letter. I'm not quite sure I could ever get there, though. I'll just be honest with you. I appreciate the fact that the chair is concerned about substantial changes in a measure on the other side, pretty much ignoring the work that was done by this committee. And I think that's a principle we should always be concerned about, preserving the work of our various committees. So I think that's important. Is there some meeting of the minds of language, if in fact there was a way to find a vehicle at this late time? I know we're up against serious deadlines with regard to amendments and those sorts of things, but is there language that could be agreeable if there in fact was a vehicle?
Well,
yes or no? There's really,
Well, hard to say depending on who you put in the room and ask what their view is on language. I think my judgment is that language could be found that essentially tightened up the language we have before us. And, I want to go to the author and or his sponsor. My understanding of your stated intent is that folks shouldn't have to comply with various requirements unless those requirements are spelled out and clear some reasonable period ahead of time. I think that's a gross oversimplification of a complicated issue. The bill in its current form, in my observation, expands dramatically on what those requirements are that are subject to these provisions as compared or contrasted with the earlier version. But I think you can tighten up the language of the bill we have before us and address some ambiguities while still having a broader list. And I think that's where, if you're simply not interested in a broader list, then I think you're not interested in a broader list, and that's fine. If you're willing to accommodate a broader list, but think that if you're going to have a broader list, by God, it's all the more important that it be tightly crafted and that there not be any ambiguity about what it means, then I think you either need another vehicle, as the Senator has described, or you need to wait until next year, or you need to do a letter to the file and then take up legislation in the coming year that will clarify some of that language as well, possibly as a committee bill if we had that much consensus on it. But all of that is prospective, and I understand that members are a little nervous about having to make commitments today with issues unresolved in the future. Why don't I ask the staff to comment on the kinds of issues that might be addressed in a letter to the file that are, obviously a letter to the file is not statute. We all understand that. That being said, it can provide significant help in clarifying the legislature's intent and the author's intent with respect to the language of the statute. Mr. Pester, you want to offer a comment or two?
Yeah, a couple of things. First, too, and this was as an additional issue too on the amendments, is the deadline in the Assembly is in 3 hours. So, as far as doing amendments, and then it's on our side tomorrow at 5. And some of the issues that I had discussed earlier were some clear definitions of some of the terms that are in the bill, which was not an issue in the analysis. So some of the definitions under compliance tool requiring further clarification. So I think in a letter to the Journal, it would outline that the intent was for there to be an all-inclusive list rather than including but not limited to and clear definitions of the terms. Also, that the modified compliance deadline only applies to the modified requirement, not the original or initial requirement, and that the intent is to also comply with the Administrative Procedure Act if there's any amendments in that. I think I covered all the issues. So basically, in the letter to the Journal, it would cover the 4 issues that the intent was for the bill to be in, just apply to those and not be covering other issues. And it is a letter to the Journal. It would show as a note in the code. And then there need to be, one of the options that was discussed is to do legislation next year to clarify those 4 issues, plus clarifying some of the terms that are in the definitions of compliance tool, if that's the way the committee goes.
The next year's legislation, what form would that take? Would that be Mr. Wright would have a bill that would deal with those specific listed issues, or
that's still part of the conversation. Could be a piece of legislation authored by Mr. Wright, if it, as I mentioned earlier, if there was enough consensus around the clarification. Could be a committee bill that came out of this committee that requires all 7 members of the committee to sign on as well. So that's an open topic still at this point in the conversation. Senator Pavley, what's your thinking?
Well, needless to say, with the confusion exactly what all these terms mean, and I appreciate Mr. Pester articulating the 3 areas of concern, I'm to the point where we're not at a couple hours before our deadline in the Assembly or anything fixing a bill that had left this committee. I would only support going back to the original bill that had passed this committee, and that's the reporting forms on the Internet for 45 or 60 days as finding a vehicle. And then let's start with Mr. Pester's concern with the brand new bill next year, and then we could, in a very thoughtful manner, understand what all these mean and what are the implications, because I think these are significant changes to the bill, and I do agree that adding the but not limited to language in that whole list of things you would have to do in the event of a regulation is problematic. I appreciate the modified portion of scaling down, but I'm not sure what what urgency there is to have to do it with the clock ticking in 2 hours to just get this through. I've had many bills held in committee saying, you know, they're not quite cooked, but bring them back next year, and sometimes I get them back next year. And so I don't see the sense of urgency on this, but I do support the original bill that I had voted on, and that was the reporting forms on the internet for transparency's sake.
Okay, and that
so I won't be supporting it.
And that bill, of course, is not before the committee and cannot be before the committee because we have an amended bill. Senator Corbett, your thoughts?
Clear as mud.
Okay.
It's very difficult for me to have an opinion on a letter to the file that I don't know exactly what it will say. And I also know that the letter to, if this is challenged, a letter to the file clearly does not have as much strength in a courtroom as the actual language of the statute. It would be very confusing for someone to interpret, I think, what we're trying to do. So this is one of those kind of things that I wish we just had a little more time, because I think we could come up with something, but we're up against the deadline, and sorry about that.
Senator Wright, I don't know where Senator Strickland and Senator Runner are on this, but I'm not in the absence of Senator Lowenthal, and well, there you go.
We're prepared to. I'm prepared to make a motion for the bill as it is, but I'm obviously that's going to be up to the author in terms of what the.
Senator Lowenthal, would you like a brief recap?
Yes.
Senator Lowenthal, we have, and I'm going to try and speak for others, and if I misspeak, they'll correct me, I'm sure. We have in my judgment, we have a significantly amended bill that has come back from the Assembly. Part of the issue is the change in scope in terms of the number of issues that are now dealt with, but a related issue is some lack of clarity about language, which generates some concern on the part of staff and Senators Pavley, Corbett, and myself that could be the basis for litigation and for delay or obstruction in terms of compliance, rather than simply giving people healthy time for compliance. There are three possibilities that have been referenced today. We can vote it up because we're working on a 48-hour rule here, so we can simply vote the bill out of committee as it is. I'm not prepared to do that, and I think Senators Corbett and Pavley have indicated they're not prepared to do that either. We can vote it down and just say we wish you well and perhaps you try again next year. And I have suggested a third possibility, which I'm open to, but which hasn't generated a lot of interest on the committee, which is to say we could do a letter to the file clarifying some of these issues where there's a little scary ambiguity, and then also anticipate either as a committee bill or a bill from Senator Wright next year some clarifying legislation. Senator Pavley has said she doesn't see the urgency for moving forward at this time, even with a letter to the file, that this might be a bill that ought to be held until next year. Senator Corbett has said maybe a letter to the file, but since we don't know what the letter to the file would look like and the obligation to make a decision is essentially before us now, she's not comfortable putting her faith in a yet-to-be-written letter to the file. I think that's a fair characterization. Senator Runner has indicated that he'd be prepared to support the bill as is, as has Mr. Strickland. So we are swimming around without much consensus on any of the three options.
And that's with the consideration in terms of support that's satisfactory then with the letter being written. I think the author made it clear that his issue with the letter would be certainly even initiated by the committee, so the committee had control of that process in that letter. And so, certainly it seems to me to, the question in regards to the concern of the committee would be satisfied in light of the fact that the committee is initiating and writing the letter.
And then the question for Senator Corbett is, I might like the letter, but she might not, and she's, of course, a different member. And
I get that.
I just wish we had a little time.
Fair enough.
No.
Don't we all?
Except for deadlines are due at 5 o'clock today. I mean, amendments due at 5 o'clock today.
So that speaks to the issue of.
Well, let me ask about that issue a little more time. Is a little more time the fact that you'd like to see the letter, or that you'd like to see an amendment? Because it seems to me a little more time to get a letter could be something that could be accomplished.
Senator Corbett,
Senator.
Let me turn to staff. What's our 48-hour timeline for taking action on the bill? Let's start there.
That 48 hours applies to the action by the committee. We received the bill 2 days ago, so we have to take an action today. So,
and my question is that 2 days, or is it 48 hours, and do we have a time certain?
That was 48 hours, and I think we received the bill. Probably, we may not want to ask whether we may be. It was close to 48 hours at this point, right?
Right up against our 48-hour deadline. All right,
when we received it.
Well, okay. Well, let me ask you this as an alternative. Could there be? Could we indeed, if the question of more time was focused on the issue of more time to be satisfied with a letter, as opposed to a piece of legislation, then it seems to me we might be able to work out this issue in regards to something off the floor, dealing with it later, dealing with the letter. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure the senator's concern is satisfied with taking a look at the letter.
It's a couple of things.
Yeah.
One is knowing what the letter says, and then also the confusion we would create by doing it this way. It's not. This is definitely not standard operating procedure.
Senator Lowenthal.
That would be confusing.
The question I had when you mentioned what would be, obviously this quite late in the process. It's come back now on concurrence. It's either up or down. The second one, to hold the bill and not to come up, how would that impact the process of what what Senator wants to do if we did a bill next year, if this bill was held? What impact would that have?
We're in the second year of a 2-year session,
right.
So obviously if we held the bill
it'd be a new bill.
It'd be a new bill, and if there's a new bill, I think, if I can paraphrase your question, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think, Senator Wright, the question from Mr. Lowenthal is, so what's the harm in waiting until next year to do a new bill?
That's right. I mean, if the question is we can't get something, it's a letter to the it's unclear. I'm not saying to do what, and people would rather see it. What I'm hearing here is rather see it in a bill rather than in a letter to the Journal. What would be the harm? What would happen?
Senator Lowenthal, the issue really boils down to those entities that are trying to comply with the requirements adopted by the ARB pursuant to AB 32,
right,
and trying to do that in good faith. They'd still be left in the situation like we run into before, where the compliance tools aren't made available at the time the regulation's promulgated, and so they're swimming around looking for ways to comply with the statute. So we just put that off yet another year.
Right.
Mr. Chair, could I, real quick question, and again, this I'm reminded, and I don't know the extent to which the letter we dealt with on Senator, I think a bill that you had dealing with some oil reuse or something, where we ended up going there. And I think, and so I don't know the extent of the clarification that this bill needs versus what we did with your bill last year. But I'm just wondering if there's any parallels to that in light of that fact that was actually done within this committee, within that understanding.
Well, I think a number of us have done letters to the file. The timing, content, circumstances in each instance are going to be different. And
that was another end of the year bill, I believe, right, in terms of a deadline issue that trying to get clarified in regards to.
To me, I think it's totally different. I clarify to what the intent, clarification on what the intent is of a piece of legislation is when you've used the file. This is significant amendments in another committee that we're trying to massage through a letter of intent that may or may not result in legislation the next year to fix it, but we're not sure how because there's no full hearing and it's clock is ticking.
I apologize. Senator Lowenthal, I'm trying to figure out if there's a consensus on the committee, which at the moment is a little bit of a struggle. If you had your druthers, would you vote to support the bill as is? Would
No.
you? Okay. Would you then would you prefer to simply vote the bill down now and ask the author to come back next year?
That'd be my preference.
And you would prefer that to trying to accommodate a letter to the file. Do I have that right?
I'm not hearing that, not knowing what's in that letter and what it is. I mean,
Again, going back to that point, is if we can wait to get the language of the letter, would that satisfy then? I mean, again, if this is coming down to the issue of trying to figure out what the letter says, it seems to me that can be accomplished within a time frame. And that goes back to the issue of if it really comes down to the issue of the content of the letter. If it's not, then then it's not worth waiting for.
Senator Wright, it's your bill. What would you like to do at this point?
Well, clearly I'd like to try to move it. If the issue that we're looking at is the content of the letter, we can hold the bill until we get the letter. And I mean, the bill at that point doesn't have to move, and it doesn't move until the content of the letter is approved. If the issue that we're dealing with is the content of the letter, that would resolve that. If it is the pleasure of the committee to kill the bill, then the letter is irrelevant. In that case, we can probably begin talking about something else, I guess. But if the concern becomes that, I mean, and as you pointed out, Mr. Chair, the committee has the option and of doing clarifying statutes if necessary, possibly as a committee bill. So that committee bill wouldn't require, I mean, as a committee bill, whether or not I liked it or not, it would be a committee bill, so it could be amended with or without me. I mean, I would, introduce it at the beginning of the session in December, but my approval would be unnecessary because it could be, as you pointed out, a committee bill that would have the flexibility of having the committee able to do whatever it wishes.
The difficulty, of course, with the committee bill is that it needs to be unanimous among the 7 committee members, and so if anybody thought the clarifications were overreaching and chose not to support the committee bill, then we're left with, a plain old-fashioned legislative debate. But, Senator Lowenthal, have you heard enough?
I'm just done.
All right, Senator, I'm sorry. I think we're just going to ask for a motion on the bill.
Move the bill. Move the bill.
All right. We have a motion by Senator Runner. Any other comments before we go forward? Call the roll.
Simitian. Runner.
Aye.
Runner, aye. Corbett. Hancock. Lowenthal. Pavley.
No.
Pavley, no. Strickland.
Aye.
Strickland, aye. 2 yes, 1 no.
Okay.
2 yes, 1 no. Senator Hancock is. Hang on.
Senator Simmons, I am here. I had a meeting in the governor's office about another bill that was scheduled. I did hear about 5 minutes of testimony.
Okay.
Back to my office, I heard the synopsis for Senator Lowenthal. And given that, I have to say I would be most comfortable myself.
All right. Okay. So, call the roll. Call the absent members, and if members would please stay, because we have one other bill to call the roll on. We do. Call the absent and non-voting members, please.
Simitian. Corbett. Hancock. Lowenthal. That's 2 to 1.
2 aye votes, 1 no vote. That is insufficient. The measure fails.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. All right, members, that takes us to the item by Assemblymember Perez. This revises certain public water system operator notices under the California Safe Drinking Water Act. Could we have a motion on the bill? Motion by Senator Pavley. Call the roll.
Hancock.
Aye.
Hancock, aye.
Forgive me, did I get straight? We lift the call. My apologies. We did establish a quorum. My mistake. Chair voted aye.
Okay.
Chair voted aye. Vice Chair voted no.
Lowenthal.
Aye.
Lowenthal, aye. Strickland.
No.
Strickland, no. 5-2.
Ayes 5, noes 2. The bill is passed. Members? Ayes 5, noes 2. Yes, Madam Clerk?
Yes.
The bill is passed. We are adjourned.